The sun rose over the horizon, not dramatically, not suddenly, but very gently, very golden, as if it had to grow accustomed itself to the light it brought. We traveled through early Austrian morning, from Vienna towards Győr, and the rails beneath the train were like a heartbeat, steady, soothing, endless. Before me, out the window, the sunflower fields began to show themselves, at first shadowy, like a memory of something I might have seen before but couldn't quite remember. Then, as the sun rose higher, as the light grew warmer, they became clearer. Great, vast fields as far as the eye could reach, nothing but sunflowers, thousands of them, perhaps millions, all facing the same direction, as if the whole world were turning toward this new sun. The light was the most important thing here, not the flowers themselves, but what the light did with them. The sunflowers weren't simply yellow, they were gold. They were light itself, as if every flower had captured the sun and was now radiating it from within. The morning light was different from midday light or evening light. It was soft. It was almost liquid. It flowed across the fields like honey growing warm, spreading. Every flower was individually visible in this early light, not an anonymous mass, but individual blooms, each with its own path to the sun, each with its own angle. And as the train passed, I saw how that angle changed, how each flower turned toward me or away, depending on where it stood, how the sun fell on it, what the light did to its face. I tried to count, but it was impossible, absolutely impossible. The fields stretched out to the forests in the distance and beyond, hill after hill, all sunflowers, all gold in the morning light. There was no doubt there, no uselessness, only growth, only abundance, only this endless, peaceful repetition of flower after flower after flower. The stems were green, dark green, in contrast to the gold of the blooms, and they swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel but could see. The train cut straight through the landscape like a knife through silk, and the fields flowed past, endless, soothing. Sometimes I saw the farmer, tiny in this golden world, like a child among giants, working on a narrow path between the rows. It was July, deepest July, the moment when sunflowers have reached their perfect ripeness, when they're no longer growing, but only shining. I'd read somewhere that sunflowers follow the sun at first, that they're young like curious children, constantly turning their heads to see where the light comes from. But in June, in July, they stop. They fix themselves facing east, waiting for mornings. And this movement ends. That's when they become adults, I think. When they stop searching and begin to understand that the sun will always return, that there's no need for all this movement. And in this morning light, I saw that. The quiet devotion, the silent expectation, the trust. A single bird flew over the field, swift, determined, as if it had an important task. Then there were more, a whole group hovering over the blooms, searching for seeds perhaps, or simply seeing the world from above. The sky was clear, a pale, tender blue, with only a few clouds at the edge that were themselves golden in the morning light. There was a feeling of infinity, a feeling that expanded the chest, that made the head light. How much time had it taken to plant these fields? How many people, how many hours of work to make it all look as if nature had done it alone? But that was the beauty of it, that human work and natural wonder were so mixed that you couldn't tell them apart anymore. The shadows beneath the blooms were so dark blue, they looked almost violet. The light on the blooms themselves wasn't just yellow, but multifaceted. Under the leaves, in the furrows of the bloom, there were areas that were greenish, that were orange, that were almost red. The eye couldn't stay long in one place without noticing how complex each flower was, how much life lived in it. The train took me ever faster past, but I tried to slow down, tried to stretch each second, tried not to lose these fields, not to pass them too quickly. We passed a small village completely surrounded by sunflowers. The houses were old, red brick, and looked as if they'd been built before these fields existed. Or perhaps the fields had grown around the houses year by year until the whole village was nothing but a small island in a golden sea. There was a well in the middle of the village, and I could imagine the people here working in the fields day by day and coming back in the evening to this well, to the coolness of the water, to the rest of the hills. Was that a good life? Was that happiness? I didn't know, but it looked peaceful. It looked right. The air coming through the half-open window was warm and smelled of something I couldn't name. Perhaps flower pollen. Perhaps just the heat itself, carrying the scent of earth and plant. I tried to hold the scent, to store it. But the train went on, and new scents came, new air, new moments. The fields changed. Now there were more mixed fields, sunflowers next to maize, next to grain, the variety of summer agriculture. But the sunflowers remained the kings, remained the most striking, the most demanding. I thought of the bees that must be in these fields. They'd be active now in the morning light, from bloom to bloom, gathering, working, dancing their information to the others. A whole universe of life happening here on a scale I couldn't really understand, playing out in this golden world. Man plants, but nature does the work, makes it live, makes it more than just fields. The train slowed. We approached a station, and the sunflowers receded. But before they were quite gone, I could look one last time into this golden world, could feel one last time what it was like to be in the middle of this infinite splendor. The morning light grew warmer, grew more yellow, became midday light, and the sunflowers lost some of their delicacy, their sanctity almost. But they remained. They would remain day by day until August, until autumn, until finally they'd be harvested. And then the light would shine on empty fields, on stubble, on dust, on what was left. A wide lake lay between two sunflower fields, reflecting the golden light, reflecting the endless blue of the sky. The lake wasn't part of the fields, was an interruption, was almost another world. But the lake, too, was golden in the morning light, and I could see water lilies, white blooms on the water that looked like little suns, that looked like miniature versions of the sunflowers. There was harmony in this landscape, an accord between the crops and wild nature. An accord sometimes found in lands where people and nature have lived together for thousands of years. I leaned my head against the window, felt the warmth of the glass, already warmed by the sun. My eyes grew heavy, not from tiredness, but from being flooded with light, from being flooded with beauty. The rattle of the train became again what it always was, a rhythm, a heartbeat, a ta-dum, 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 that kept me in motion while the golden fields slowly faded. And I closed my eyes, but the sunflowers remained there, behind my eyelids, luminous, golden, endless. The scent was still there in my nose, in my hair, everywhere. I could feel the warmth of the light hitting my face, slowly bringing me into a warm, gentle state. The heat of the July morning mixed with the warmth of the train, and I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. It was all one, all warm, all golden. The train rattled on, ta-dun, 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 and I drifted away, drifted into this warm state, into this golden world that my eyes no longer needed to see. The sunflowers were everywhere, everywhere, ta-dun, ta-dun, sleeping, sleeping, in the warm July light, ta-dun. I met the stove setter on the journey from Košice to Prešov, across the flat, snow-covered landscape of the Slovak plain, where the houses are small, red-tiled with white walls, where the chimneys pour out smoke, white, gently curling, like the breath of the houses themselves. He sat opposite me, a broad man, muscular, with a face like polished stone, hard but warm, with eyes that were green, the color of firs, the color of forest. His beard was dark, threaded with silver, and his hands were enormous, the hands of a laborer, of a man who'd done heavy work his whole life, who could carry heavy things, who could move heavy things with a kind of ease, with a kind of confidence I immediately respected. The train was warm, and through the windows you could see the houses slip past, see the smoke clouds rising from the chimneys, each smoke cloud a story, each one a stove. I asked what he did for a living, and he said at once, without hesitation, that he was a stove setter, that he built and repaired stoves, that he'd spent his whole life setting stoves, that these stoves were his life, that these stoves were his heart. The word stove setter was somehow romantic to me. It sounded like something old, something from fairy tales, but he spoke of it with a practical, direct confidence that immediately told me this was his trade, his true craft, his whole life. A stove setter, he explained to me, was a man who built stoves, tile stoves, brick stoves, traditional stoves that gave people warm living rooms, that gave them warmth from autumn to spring, from October to April, warming heat that came from fire, from burning wood, from mankind's ancient ability to tame fire, to shape it, to use it. He told me that building a stove was a science, a craft, an old way that had to be understood if you wanted to do it right. There was something called draft, he said, and heat radiation, and the way the fire circulated in the stove, the way the hot gases wanted to rise, how you had to force these gases to stay long, to linger long in the stove before they went out through the chimney, so that the heat could transfer to the stove, to the tiles, to the bricks, to the walls themselves. And if you didn't do it right, he said, if you didn't understand exactly how the airflow worked, then you'd build a stove that wouldn't get warm, that wouldn't work, that would be a waste of material, a waste of time. But if you did it right, if you understood the principle, if you combined the laws of thermodynamics, as modern people called them, with practices thousands of years old, then you could build a stove that was perfect, that stored heat, that gave heat, that functioned for years and years without growing weary. The stove setter showed me a small model made of clay that he carried with him, a miniature stove, perfectly proportioned, with every detail, the tiles, the openings, the chimney draught. With this model, he said, he could show a customer what he would build, could show him the proportions, could explain how the principle worked. And sometimes, he said, people would cut the model apart to see what it looked like inside, to understand the internal structure, the path the smoke took, the chamber where the heat caught and stored. This little model, he said, with a very serious expression, this little model was important, because most people wouldn't understand how a stove functioned, because they'd see a stove as a simple thing, a box where you made fire. But it wasn't simple. It was very complex. It was almost an artwork, a sculpture that also functioned, that also made warmth, that also improved a person's life, that gave him heat in the darkness, in the cold. He told me he began working at 12 years old with his father in a village near Kozice, and his father taught him everything, year after year, brick by brick, stove by stove, how to lay the tiles, how to make the mortar, how to understand the shape of a stove, how to work with his hands, how to respect the materials, how to respect the laws of physics and nature that came alive in a stove. And those were hard years, he said, because his father was strict, because mistakes weren't tolerated, because a wrongly laid brick meant you had to start over, that you had to tear it all out, redo it all. But from that strictness came perfection, he said, a perfection he understood now, a perfection that had made him the best stove setter in 3 districts, perhaps the best in the whole country. The stove setter said there were very few stove setters left now, that people wanted modern heating systems, gas central heating, oil heating, electric heating, things that were quick, that needed less attention, that meant less work. But these modern heating systems, he said, with a sort of contempt I could understand, needed electricity, needed gas, needed external energy sources that weren't sustainable, that damaged the environment. Whereas a stove, a traditional stove, fired with wood, with local wood, with wood you could chop yourself, that was a way of living that was sustainable, that respected nature, that worked with nature, not against it. And that's why, he said, he still built stoves, because he believed these stoves were important, that these traditional heating methods were important, that people needed to understand that warmth was sacred, something that had to be respected, something that was direct contact with nature. We drew ever closer to Prešov, and the stove setter described to me a house he'd just finished, an old house he'd restored, with a new stove he'd built. A stove built on an old design, but with modern materials, with insulation, with new tiles that were more beautiful than anything he'd ever made. And the man who owned this house had wept, said the stove setter, when he lit a fire in that stove for the first time, when the first heat came from that stove, the first warmth in that house after years of cold, after years almost of misery. And those tears, said the stove setter, those tears were the reason he still worked, why he still loved this profession, why he still believed his work was important, why his hands still mattered. And as this man spoke, as I gazed out the window at those small houses with their chimneys, I realized I saw the smoke clouds differently now. That I understood each of those smoke clouds was the work of a man like this. That each of those stoves was a work of art, a product of patience, of craftsmanship, of love. The stove setter also told me about the color of the tiles, how you had to mix the colors, how the blues and the greens and the golds came from natural materials, how the tiles then had to be fired in ovens at certain temperatures at certain times, so the color would be right, so the glaze would be shiny, so the tiles would last for decades. He said that a good stove, once it was built, didn't need rebuilding, that it simply functioned, year after year, winter after winter, that the heat helped the tiles, that the tiles stored the heat, that this relationship between fire and tile was a kind of marriage, that this relationship worked because both understood what they had to do, because both had understood that cooperation was better than conflict. And this idea that two things, fire and tile, could work together for the good of a person, for a person's warmth, suddenly seemed profound to me, suddenly seemed to be more than mere craftsmanship. And I closed my eyes slowly, and I saw stoves, red bricks, orange tiles, and the fire in them, the warm fire, the glow, the light that pushed back darkness, that filled rooms, that filled bodies. And the smoke rose. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And the people inside, beside the stove, warm, safe, loved, together. Ta-dum, ta-dum. And the hands of the stove setter, laying, forming, creating, with respect, with love, and the warmth, the sacred, ancient warmth that had warmed mankind for thousands of years, kept mankind warm, made mankind safe. And I grew warm, so warm, and my eyes grew heavy, heavier and heavier, and the warmth surrounded me, like an embrace, like a promise. I met the beetroot farmer on the journey from Debrecen to Nyíregyháza, across the Hungarian plain, where the landscape is so flat you'd think the horizon was the edge of the world, where fields stretch up to the sky, white with snow now in winter, where the farmsteads are small in this great, quiet landscape, scattered far apart, as though people here didn't want to be too close to one another. He sat opposite me, a tall, thin man, with hands that were cracked, dark with earth he couldn't quite wash away, though I could see he'd tried, that he'd cleaned himself up for this train journey. His face was lined, bronze brown, as though the sun and wind had shaped him his whole life, as though nature had made him part of the earth itself, part of this flat, endless landscape. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite fit him, that was too formal for a man like him, accustomed to work clothes, to dirty work. But he sat in it with dignity, as though he understood that certain moments required different clothing. I asked what he did for a living, and he smiled a little, a tired smile, but warm, not without joy. He said he was a beetroot farmer, that he'd spent his whole life growing beetroots, that his father was a beetroot farmer, his grandfather was a beetroot farmer, that these beetroots lived in the earth of his family, that these beetroots had become part of his body, that he couldn't let go of this work even if he sometimes wanted to. And the word beetroot farmer was simple, but it carried a gravity, a weight that I immediately felt that this man had a true craft, even if it looked simple, even if most people wouldn't understand it, wouldn't value it. Beetroots, he explained to me, weren't simply just vegetables. They were life insurance. They were a farmer's hope that he'd survive the winter, that his family would have food, that he could make money with his beetroots on the market, selling to the factories. He told me that growing beetroots was an art, a difficult art, something you couldn't simply learn, something you had to understand from childhood, that you had to understand the beetroots, that you had to understand the earth, that you had to understand the seasons. It all began with soil preparation, he said, in the autumn already. When the harvest was over, you had to prepare the soil for the next spring, had to loosen it, had to treat it with compost, with everything the earth needed to be fertile, to bear new beetroots. And then, in spring, when the snow melts and the earth begins to live, you had to plant the seeds, small, in perfect rows, at perfect depth, because depth mattered. Too shallow, and the beetroots wouldn't grow large enough. Too deep, and they couldn't sprout, couldn't grow. And there were 1,000 things that could go wrong, he said. Pests, diseases, wrong temperatures, too much rain, too little rain. Everything could ruin the harvest. Everything could drive a farmer mad. The beetroot farmer showed me a beetroot he carried with him, well preserved in a paper bag. A large, round beetroot, deep red, heavy, full of life, full of strength. With this beetroot, he said, you could do many things. You could store it for months, months in storage in the cold, and it wouldn't spoil, wouldn't rot. If you stored it properly, at the right temperature, with the right humidity. And this storage, he said, was the secret of winter, was the way a farmer brought his family through the winter, how he made money until spring when the new beetroots came. This beetroot in my hand was heavy, heavy with promise, heavy with hope, heavy with all the months of work that were necessary to grow it, to preserve it. And I realized, as I held this beetroot, that I didn't simply hold a vegetable, that I held a person's hope, that I held a person's chance at survival, that I held his family. He told me of the time of storage, the darkest time of the year for a farmer, when the beetroots lie in the cellar, in the depths of the earth, when you must go down every day to check them, to see if any have begun to rot, if any pests have come, if the temperature is right, if the humidity is correct. And sometimes, he said, you had to remove bad beetroots, had to throw them away, had to watch the fruits of your labor decay, had to see months of work go to waste because nature showed no mercy, because nature had no understanding for farmers, only rules, only physical laws. But the beetroot farmer, he said, had to keep going, had to hope, had to believe that most of the beetroots would survive, that they'd make it through winter, that they'd bring good money on the market in spring, when the buyers came, when the factories came, when the city people were hungry for fresh vegetables. The man said he'd been a beetroot farmer for 50 years, that he'd been working this landscape for 50 years, this flat, quiet landscape that was his whole life, that he knew better than his own hands. And in those 50 years, he said, he'd seen droughts, floods, frosts that killed all the beetroots, blight that destroyed the whole harvest, good years and bad years, rich years and poor years. But he was still here, he said, with a kind of pride. He was still a beetroot farmer. He was still in this earth because he loved this work, because he couldn't do otherwise, because the beetroots had become part of his being, because he couldn't imagine himself without this flat landscape, without these beetroots in the earth. We drew ever nearer to Nyíregyháza, and the beetroot farmer gazed out the window at this snow-drifted landscape, at the houses with their storage cellars, at all the work done in this winter, silent, in the dark, beneath the earth, where no one could see it, where only the beetroots lived, where only hope lived. And he said he was grateful he could still work, that he still had strength, that nature hadn't spat him out yet, that he could grow a few more years of beetroots before his body became too weak, before he had to give up. But his son, he said, his son didn't want to be a beetroot farmer, didn't want to work on this flat landscape, didn't want to spend months in cellars, didn't want to depend on beetroots, wanted a simpler life, a city life. And that broke his heart, said the beetroot farmer, not because he wanted to control his son, but because he knew this profession, this craft, would die with him, that the knowledge gathered by generations of beetroot farmers would be lost. And I thought about it as the train traveled through the flat, quiet landscape. How many beetroot farmers there were left. How many still practiced these old crafts. How many people still lived directly from the earth, still immediately dependent on nature, not yet disconnected from all modern systems. The beetroot farmer told me that winter work was the most important, that storage was the most critical time, that a single mistake, a single moment of carelessness could ruin the whole harvest, that everything, a whole year of work, could be lost in one night if the cold became too strong, if the humidity went wrong, if pests came, unnoticed, stealthy, destructive. He also told me about the worries that kept a farmer awake at night, how you lay in bed thinking of all the beetroots in the cellar, in the depths of the earth, whether they were still alive, still breathing, still hoping. And sometimes, he said, he couldn't sleep, had to go down into the cellar, into the darkness with a lamp to check, to see that everything was still okay, that the beetroots were still there, that they weren't rotting, that the temperature was right. And this night work, this night worry, that was the price a farmer had to pay. That was the love he owed a plant he cultivated, that he nourished, that he protected in winter from the cold, from the elements, from death almost. And I closed my eyes slowly, and I saw beetroots, deep red, heavy in the dark earth, stored, preserved, waiting for spring, for markets, for people who would eat them and wouldn't appreciate how much work was in every single beetroot, how much hope, how much love. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. The rattle of the train. Ta-dum, ta-dum. And the hands of the beetroot farmer. The earth, the beetroots, the hope, the hope, the hope. And my breath grew slower, and my eyes grew heavy, and I became the beetroot, became the earth, became the waiting, the silent, patient waiting beneath the earth, where it was warm, where it was safe, where life still pulsed, where hope still lived, still shone like the stars above, like the promise of life. Spring. Spring comes again, comes surely, and everything will be green again. Everything will be warm again. And the beetroots know that. And I know it too, now, while I sleep, while I am beneath the earth. Ta-dum, ta-dum. And the earth sleeps with me, and we wait together, warm, safe, full of hope. I met the silversmith on the journey from Krakow to Tarnów, through the snow-covered landscape of Little Poland, where the houses are old, houses hundreds of years old, carrying history in their stones, still telling of the days when this region was part of glorious Poland, when kings and merchants lived here. He sat opposite me, a small, slender old man, but with hands that were exceptional. Hands that looked like an artist's hands. Elegant, precise, with long, thin fingers. Fingers like flutes, like musical instruments. Hands that had obviously done fine, delicate work their whole life. His face was old, lined like parchment, but his eyes were bright, pale blue, the eyes of an artist, the eyes of a man who still saw beautiful things, who still experienced the world full of beauty, not with delusion, but with the way of a man who'd learned to see beauty in simplicity and craftsmanship. I asked what he did for a living, and he answered at once, with a certain pride that immediately appealed to me, that he was a silversmith, that he'd worked with silver his whole life, that he restored old silver objects, that he created new things from silver, that he was an artist, a craftsman, a man who worked with the noblest of metals, except gold. And that word, silversmith, sounded to me like it came from a medieval novel. It sounded of guilds, of apprentices, of a time when craftsmanship was still sacred, when a craftsman was still respected, when a master still had power in his guild, in his city. But this man still worked, he said, here in Kazimierz, in a small house, in a small workshop, where his grandfather had already worked with silver, where his father had worked with silver, where he still worked with silver now, where perhaps his grandson wouldn't work with silver, but the workshop would still be there, would still exist, would still carry history. The silversmith told me he began working at 12 years old, not as an employee, but as his father's apprentice. That he had to do everything at first. The simple things: cleaning, organizing the workshop, tending the furnace. Because a silversmith also works with fire. Because you have to heat silver. Because sometimes you have to melt it. Because you have to shape it with heat and strength. But after years, after many years of patience, of silent observation, starting with the simplest tasks, he was allowed to begin working himself, was allowed to make small things, at first under his father's strict oversight, later increasingly alone, until finally he himself became a master, until he could teach apprentices, until he could create works of art. The man showed me a silver bowl he carried with him, carefully wrapped in cloth. A beautiful bowl, old, perhaps from the 19th century, with patterns, with handles, with a history you could see. A history of meals, of celebrations, of generations of people who touched this bowl, who'd eaten from it. "This bowl," he said, "a man brought to me 3 weeks ago, a man from the village, whose grandmother had inherited this bowl from her mother, who'd inherited it from her mother, and now it had grown dark, no longer shiny. It was tarnished. It was old. It was tired. And this man," said the silversmith, "asked me to clean this bowl, to restore it, to make it beautiful again, the way it was before. And I did that," he said. "I worked on it hour after hour, with special cloths, with special pastes, with all the knowledge I've acquired in my life. And slowly, very slowly, the beauty returned, the shine returned. The story came back to life, the whole past of this bowl, all the people who touched it, all the love that had been put into this bowl, all that came forth again." "And when the man received his bowl back," said the silversmith, "he wept. This strong man wept. Tears flowed, because he understood that not just an object had been restored, but that his past had been restored, that the continuity of his life had been restored, that the connection to his grandmother, to his great-grandmother, had been restored. And these tears," said the silversmith, "these tears justify my whole life, my whole work, all the hours, all the years I've spent in my workshop, all the pain in my joints, all the weariness. It was all worth it for these tears, for this love that restored itself, that manifested in silver and in tears." The silversmith said that the craft of silversmithing was a dying craft, that there weren't enough customers anymore, that people today no longer had understanding for handmade things, for true works of art, that they wanted cheap industrial products made quickly, sold quickly, that had no soul, but also had no sins, no responsibility, no love. And this loss, he said, this loss of craftsmanship, of true skill, of true mastery, this loss was a tragic thing. A thing that made humanity poorer, even if it didn't see how poor it would become, even if it didn't understand what it was losing. But he could do nothing about it, he said, except to keep on working, to keep on creating works of art, to pass on his knowledge to the few who were still interested, who could still understand what it meant to work with silver, what it meant to preserve history, what it meant to create beauty. We drew ever closer to Tarnów, and the silversmith told me of his workshop in Kazimierz, of the tools that were hundreds of years old, that his grandfather had inherited from his grandfather, that still functioned, that were still used, that were still part of his daily work. And these tools, he said, these were inheritance, not just physically, but spiritually, that every tool had a name, that every tool had a soul, that every tool reminded him of the men who'd used it before him, that every tool was a life itself in a way. And when he worked with these tools, he said, then he didn't work alone. Then he worked with his forefathers. Then his grandfathers were with him. Then the whole history of his family was with him. Generations of masters guiding him, inspiring him, showing him how it was done. And as I listened to this old man speak, I realized I wasn't simply talking to a craftsman, but to living history, to a living archive of skills, of knowledge, of artistry that went back thousands of years, to the first silversmiths, to the medieval masters, to the Renaissance artists. That this man was a channel, a living channel through which old arts still flowed, still lived, still exercised their power. The silversmith also told me about the beauty of the material, how silver felt, how it shone, how it reflected light waves in a way no other material could, how silver was almost alive, how it communicated with you when you worked with it, how it guided you if you listened, if you were sensitive to it, if you were ready to understand the silent language of metal. And I closed my eyes slowly, and I saw silver, shining, beautiful, shaping itself under fire and hands, transforming from raw metal into works of art, into bowls, into jewelry, into things that were beautiful, that endured time, that generations used, that carried history, that carried love, that joined past to present, that announced the future. And the train rattled on, ta-dun, ta-dun, ta-dun. And I was in the workshop now, in the warm workshop, full of light, full of fire, full of history, full of ghosts of old masters looking over the shoulders of my guide. And I saw the hands of the silversmith working, filing, polishing, shaping, with a precision that was indescribable, with a love that was visible, with a devotion that was sacred, that was reverent. And the silver shone, sparkled, shimmered, ta-dum, ta-dum. And I became silver, became formable, became beautiful, became part of this endless succession of artists, this endless chain of masters and apprentices, this eternal connection between hand and heart. And all was warm and shining, and full of meaning, full of purpose, full of love. And my eyes grew heavy, heavy, so very heavy, and everything faded, the shine, the fire, the hands, the workshop. Everything became dark, peaceful, quiet, like silver in the night, glowing faintly, a glimmer, an echo, a memory. And I slept, safe in the hands of old masters, protected, remembered, loved. The Semmering is one of Europe's legendary mountain railway routes, and in winter, it's like a fairy tale. The locomotive huffs and struggles up the mountain, through tunnels, over viaducts built like ancient monuments into the snow. We're traveling from Gloknitz to Mürzuschlag, and outside the world is white. Absolutely white. Interrupted only by black rocks and the dark crevices where the railway winds. The sky is fluffy gray, and fresh snowflakes fall gently, as if they don't really want to fall, just marking time. I'm sitting by the window, fascinated by this technical and natural beauty, and beside me sits a man, certainly in his 60s, wearing a wool jacket in brown and a cashmere cap. But the first thing I notice about him isn't his face, it's the scent. It smells like cedarwood and fresh shavings, the perfect smell of a forest after rain. Then I see him take a piece of linden wood from a small rucksack beside him, no larger than a mandarin, and a knife. But not just any knife. It's small and fine, with a handle of pale wood, and the blade is so sharp it glints in the pale light. The man opens the knife with the same devotion a pianist opens his sheet music and begins to carve. The wood shavings fall immediately, tiny, thin slivers that look like snowflakes. In fact, they match perfectly with the real snow outside. The man works with absolute concentration, but also with a strange quietness. There's no tension in his face, no doubt. His eyes follow the shape of the wood, and his hands know what to do. After just a few minutes, I see a bird beginning to take shape. A small bird, perhaps a swallow, with outstretched wings that seem to grow from the wood like a real thing that has simply waited for light to be born. "That will be beautiful," I say, and the man looks over at me. His face is kind, weathered, with deep lines around the eyes. "Thank you," he says with an Austrian accent. "But I don't know that yet. The wood doesn't know it yet. We have to wait until we discover it together." He looks back at the bird and continues carving. "You see, the wood has its own plan. My work is only to listen." He speaks whilst he works, and his story comes out slowly, like the shape of the bird. His name is Franz. He's been a woodcarver his whole life, starting as a boy with his grandfather, who was a master. He's carved church decorations, mantels, furniture. But his favorite, he says, is carving small things. Birds, hands, faces. Things that fit in the palm of your hand. "That's the real thing," says Franz. "Not the big art that hangs on walls. The small art that people carry in their pockets and touch with their fingers." The train enters a tunnel. For a moment, it's dark, completely dark. No light from outside. Franz simply stops, doesn't move his knife. He waits. I hear the beat of the locomotive, the roar of the tunnel, as the world narrows and then opens again. And then we're out, and the snow is still snow white, the flakes still falling gently. Franz looks at his bird and nods slightly, as if encouraging it. Then he continues carving. After about 15 minutes, Franz says something that holds me. "Something happened to me 2 years ago," he says. "I was carving a piece of oak wood, a big piece. It was meant to be a Madonna. I worked on it for 3 weeks. And then, suddenly, a crack appeared. A crack went right through the figure, destroyed everything. I thought, that's the end. The wood is destroyed. The work is over." Franz sets down his knife and holds the almost finished bird up to the light, examining it from all sides. But the wood decided otherwise. It set me limits through that crack, and I had to stop imagining that I controlled the forest. The wood controls me. I sit quietly and listen. We're now crossing a viaduct. I feel the floor tilt slightly, and outside it's just snow-white sky and black stones, nothing else. "What did you do with the Madonna?" I ask. Franz smiles. "That's the beauty of it. The wood offered me the crack, and I followed it. I carved the Madonna still, but not as I'd planned. It became something else, something broken, but real. The crack wasn't a mistake. The crack was the story." The knife now rests in Franz's lap. The bird is finished. It's truly beautiful. The wings are spread, the head lifted, as if just about to take flight, into the snow, into the sky. Franz regards his work with a look of complete satisfaction, not because it's perfect, but because it's true. It's something that came straight from his heart and passed through the linden wood and landed in this form. "For my granddaughter," says Franz. "She's going to America to study. The bird is meant to give her courage." He folds the knife with great care, not hurried, but with a respect for the tool that has accompanied him his whole life. Wood shavings are scattered everywhere, in his lap, on the seat, a few on my knees too. They smell wonderful, like small pieces of spring that grew somewhere on the Semmering. Franz puts the knife away, and the bird disappears into a small wooden box lined with cloth. Then he leans his head against the windowsill. One of his eyes closes. Not both, but the one does, and I see that his body relaxes. That's the deep relaxation of someone who has completed work. Not the sort of rest one needs because one is tired, but the rest that comes when you've made something real. The other person beside him isn't asleep, but he's resting too. His hand lies on the wood shavings in his lap, as if to say, "This is me. Forest, wood, hands, time." The Semmering carries him further up the mountain, through the snow, through the tunnels, and he simply sits there, at peace. I sit there and think of those words. The wood decided otherwise. And I begin to understand that perhaps our lives are like that too. Perhaps we also have cracks, unexpected breaks, places where our original plans shatter. But that's not the end. That's perhaps only the point where the wood, where we, begin to find our true shape. The shape the tree always had before we felled it. The person we always were before we tried to become someone else. The train continues on. The snowflakes still fall gently. Franz breathes quietly, his head resting against the cold window, and the small wooden box with the bird lies safely in his hands. And I lean my head back too, and feel the warmth of the train, still smell the wonderful cedar sharpness of the wood, and begin to relax. The bird is finished. Franz will sleep. And I'm here, in this moment, on this old railway, with this master of wood, while the Semmering winds beneath us, and the snow falls like an old familiar song that sings the whole world to sleep. I sat opposite her on a warm spring day, on the route from Münster to Ham. And I knew at once that she carried something great with her. Not something heavy, you understand, but something meaningful. Something she'd carried her whole life and would carry for the last time today. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair that she wore loose, with hands that were small but absolutely sure, like hands that had brought thousands of small people into the world, hands that knew patience, that knew strength, that knew when it was time to push and when it was time to let go. She wore a green coat, the coat of a woman who still cared for her appearance, but not with passion, with a kind of self-evident dignity. I asked her where she was going, and she looked first out the window, across the green fields that shone so bright in this spring, so full of promise. Then she told me she was going to a birth, a home birth in Ham, a young woman who would become a mother for the 3rd time. This is her last one, she said then, very quietly, very matter-of-factly, as if to say it might rain today. Her very last birth after 40 years. 40 years, I repeated, and she nodded, and I could see how this nod contained many, many years. Thousands of nights, thousands of moments when she'd brought life into the darkness, into fear, into hope. She told me she began in 1984, very young then. Not so much knowledge at the time, but much love, much determination. The first birth had been in the clinic, a long night, a woman who couldn't believe she'd manage. And then she managed, and the baby came. And the midwife, she, the woman sitting opposite me, knew in that moment that this was what she was born for. Not to make a career, not to become famous, but to be present in this sacred moment, to protect this sacred moment, to hold this sacred moment. Since then, she'd never really left this calling. Not truly, not in her heart. She described birth to me as something indescribable, but something one had to try to describe every time again, because it was different each time, because each baby came differently, because each mother was anxious differently, hopeful differently. Some births are quick, she said, as if the child already knows it's expected and can't come fast enough. Others are slow, patient, as if the child must first understand the world before entering it, and the midwife must know what kind of birth it is before the birth itself begins. You see it in the woman's eyes. You see it when you place your hand on her belly and feel the child waiting, living, already having thoughts that no one knows except itself. She had a routine, she said, something she does at every birth before the baby comes. She holds the woman's hand, and she tells her, not with words, but with her hand, she says, "You can do this. You will be able to do this. You are stronger than you believe." And often the woman then says, "I'm afraid." And the midwife answers, "Fear is good. Fear means you understand what's coming. But you'll manage. I know you'll manage." And somehow that helps. Somehow the fear becomes something else then, something stronger, something the woman needed to do what she had to do. 40,000 births, I said, just to make sure I understood her correctly. She shook her head. Not 40,000, she said, but around 3,000. 3,000 small people who came into this world because of her. 3,000 mothers she helped. 3,000 first cries she heard. 3,000 moments when she knew she was doing the right thing. I still know some of these people, she said. Some have sent me photos of their children, their grandchildren. And then I see the mothers I knew in the faces of these children. And I see the grandmothers in them, and the great-grandmothers. And it's like a great tree that grew from my hands. She looked out the window again, and spring was still there, and the fields were still green, and everywhere life was everywhere. Everywhere nature was bringing forth new things. That's the gift, she said, that I was allowed to be in this moment for decades. This moment when life begins. Other people work in offices, others in factories, others on machines. But I was allowed to be present when nature accomplishes its greatest wonder, when life embraces life, when a woman becomes a mother. Every time, every single time, it was a miracle. But it's time, she said, and her voice grew a little quieter. 40 years is a long time. The hands grow older, not less sure, but older. And there are younger midwives, women with the same calling, the same love, the same patience. I leave that to them, she said. That's not giving up, that's passing it on. That's understanding that all good things need space to end, so new things can begin. She showed me a photo on her phone. Today's woman. The woman she'd go to. She was radiant in the photo, pregnant, with husband, with 2 small children. And the midwife said it was a fortune that she could care for this woman, that she looked forward to this day like no other day in her life. Not because it's the last birth, though that's true too, but because it's a birth, because a new life comes into the world, and she gets to be there. She gets to help. She gets to hold this sacred moment. The train went faster and faster, ever closer to Ham, and I could see the midwife grow calm, how she prepared for what would come. She took out her bag, an old black bag that had perhaps been with her for 40 years, and checked what was inside, not with nervousness, but with that same calm, that same certainty that had accompanied her whole life. Everything was there. Everything was ready. Life was waiting in Ham, waiting for her hands, for her wisdom, for her love. And I looked at her, and I saw in her eyes not farewell. I saw fulfillment. 40 years of fulfillment. 40 years of knowing she was doing the right thing. That's more than many people have, I said to her, and she smiled and said, yes, that's true. It's been a great gift, this life, this work, these women, these babies, everything from beginning to end. And as we drew into Ham Station, as the train slowed and came to a stop, I felt the midwife straighten up, felt her prepare for the final journey, the greatest journey, into the moment, into the sacred moment, into her final birth. And I thought, this is not the end. This is a beginning. This is always a beginning. Every birth is a beginning. And this midwife, this woman, these hands, this wisdom, They brought a new person into the world for the very last time, and it was just as sacred as the first time. The doors opened, and she stood up, gently, surely, and I saw her take the bag and go out into the warm spring air, to the life that waited. And my eyes grew tired, so tired, and my head slowly sank back onto the seat, and my thoughts grew weaker and weaker. Birth, life, beginning, and the warmth of spring came through the window. Warm, so warm. And the midwife with her old wise hands, the last hands to hold a baby, and the first, and the first. And everything became one, became warm, became... An older man sat opposite me on the journey from Bonn to Koblenz on a warm summer's day, and I saw at once in his face something I can only describe as both fulfillment and farewell. It was the face of someone who'd brought something to an end, not because it went bad, but because the time had come, because 42 years is enough, because you can't get everything from something without destroying it in the process. He was tall, this man, with white hair and large, warm eyes, the sort of eyes that had looked at many, many people in their life. Young people, people who were frightened, people who needed hope. I asked him what kind of day he'd had, and his smile was so complete, so content, that I already knew before he answered. My last day of school, he said. And he said that not with sadness, not with regret. He said it with a voice that sounded like someone whose long road has come to an end. Not because the road was bad, but because he'd reached his destination. 42 years, I said, and he nodded. And I could see, this man saw something I couldn't see. He saw all those years, all those classrooms, all those faces, all those moments that had brought him to this moment. He told me he began in 1982 at a school near Bonn, young, full of energy, full of thoughts about what he'd teach his students, how he'd change the world, how he'd prepare these young people for their future lives. Mathematics was his subject, but not just mathematics. Mathematics was only the tool, he said, the tool to teach them that there's order in the world, that there's logic, that there's meaning in things. But much more important than mathematics was the way of thinking, the way of seeing, the way of understanding that nothing's accidental, that everything's connected to everything else, that the world isn't chaos, but a great pattern. You only need to understand to see it. And in all those years, he said, I watched my students grow, how they began so small and unsure, and then how they changed, how they learned they were cleverer than they believed, that they could solve problems, that they could think, real, deep thinking. Some of them became engineers, he said. Some became doctors. Some became artists. Some became parents. Some simply became good people. And that might be the most important thing of all. They all began in my classroom as children, frightened of equations, frightened of numbers, and they left as people who understood they could think. He showed me a book lying on his lap, a thick red book filled with notes and photos and signatures, signatures everywhere, hundreds of them. A guest book, he said, from all those years, from all those students. Today, on my last day, they gave me this book, all of them together, all the classes, all the students I've taught in the last few weeks, and they wrote what I meant to them, how I influenced them, how I changed them. And I could see, as I turned through it, that the signatures weren't just names. They were little messages, little thanks, little love declarations. A kind of love that can grow between a teacher and his students when it's real work, when there's real heart. "But it's time to go," he said. And that sentence mattered. I felt it. "It's not that I don't love school. I love it too much, perhaps," he said. "Too much to stay when the time has come. I've known colleagues who stayed too long, who couldn't leave because they didn't know who they were outside the classroom. And I didn't want to become that. I wanted to leave while I still had the strength, while I still had the love, while I still knew who I was as a teacher, not as a routine, not as a tired old man explaining the same lesson twice because he's too tired to know he's already explained it." The teacher gazed out the window, over the Rhine rushing past, calm, content, like an old river that's seen everything already and knows that life goes on, always onwards, moment after moment, year after year. "And I see that in you," I said to him. "This calm, this certainty." He nodded and said, "Yes, that's the secret. You must understand that every beginning is also an end, and every end is also a beginning. I end my career as a teacher, yes, but I begin something new, something I don't know, something that will surprise me. And that's not fear, that's hope." The last lesson this morning, he told me, wasn't mathematics. The last lesson was me telling my students, "This is my last day." And I didn't tell them they should be sad, because I thought sadness wouldn't be the right emotion for this moment. I told them, "This is a good ending. I was ready to come, you were ready to learn, and I'm ready to go. And perhaps in a few years I'll open the newspaper and read that one of you did something great, something good. And I'll know I had a very small part in that I planted something in you, a seed that grows, that blooms, that bears fruit." And he opened the red book again and showed me a page. A signature from a young girl, perhaps 17 years old, who wrote, "Mr. Muller, you showed me I'm not stupid. Thank you." And he said that was the most important thing he'd done in 42 years. Not that he taught them mathematics, that was only the means. The most important thing was that he showed them they were worthy, that they could think, that they could make a difference in the world. The train rushed on, ever closer to Koblenz, and the teacher grew slower. His breath grew calmer, and I saw how the weariness of the day, the good weariness of a day well lived, came into his face. His eyes grew tired, but not sad, happily tired. Eyes that grew tired on a good day, on a day that had meaning. And I saw him take his book again, the red book, and press it to his heart, very gently, very tenderly, like someone holding something precious that he doesn't want to let go of, but does anyway, because it's time to let go. I asked him if he was afraid of what was to come, of retirement, of the emptiness that might come when someone stops teaching, when school is no longer there, no longer the structure, no longer the purpose. He thought for a long time before answering, and then he said, "Afraid? No, not really. I've known who I am for 42 years. I'm Mr. Muller, the mathematics teacher. And now I'll be someone else. I don't know exactly who, but perhaps that's okay. Perhaps that's even good. Perhaps I'm still me, just without the classroom. And perhaps I can find in this new person something good I couldn't find in the teacher person." And my own eyes grew tired now, and I felt how this teacher's story flowed into my dreams, how all those decades of knowledge and love he'd given now were given to me too, just by listening, just by seeing it in his eyes. 42 years. 42 years of days, of hours, of moments with students. And now it was over. And it was good. So good. And everything became warm and heavy and quiet. The Rhine rushed. The train rattled. And the mathematics of the world, the great silent equation of life and love, it lulled me to sleep. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. The students slept, the teacher slept, and I slept. And then, suddenly, on the journey from Leipzig to Halle, on a grey autumn journey, when the leaves had almost all fallen and the world looked like an old drawing, faded and full of memories, then a scent came to me. A scent so unexpected, so complete, that for a moment I didn't know where I was. It was the scent of old paper, of yellowed pages, of books that had lain in shelves for decades, of ink that had faded, of time woven into fibers. I closed my eyes, and I wasn't alone anymore. I was with someone I hadn't seen in a long time, but had never forgotten. My grandfather was a librarian, you see, and this scent was his scent. It was the scent of his work, the scent of his life, the scent that always came from him when he came home, with this scent in his clothes, in his hair, on his skin. And I remembered all the visits I made as a child to the library, how I was led by my grandfather's hand through the long rows of books, and how he showed me that every book was a world, that every page was a life, that these books together were a great memory of humanity, a memory that didn't fade, that didn't die, that was eternal. My grandfather, he wasn't a man of grand gestures, not a man with a loud voice. No, he was quiet, very quiet, and he only spoke when it was important to speak. But in the library, in this temple of paper and ink, in this place where voices were soft and thoughts were loud, there he was completely himself. He knew every one of these books, knew where every book belonged, knew the authors, the titles, the pages. Not because he had a perfect memory, but because he loved every book, because the knowledge from these books lived in his heart. And I remember that as a small boy, I asked why he didn't simply discard the old books, the yellowed ones, the worn ones. And he sat beside me and he took an old book in his hand. It was by Goethe, I think, or by Schiller. I can't remember anymore. But it was old, at least 100 years old. And he opened it very carefully, very tenderly. And he said to me, "This book has already lived for centuries. Decades of people have read it, have put their thoughts into these words, and these words have lived in their hearts. If I throw this book away, if I give it away or destroy it, then I say to all these people, to all these readers who are now dead, I say, your love for this book doesn't matter anymore." But that isn't true. That will never be true. And he showed me a bookmark, an old one made of paper, that was stuck between the pages. And on this bookmark was a name written and a date, 1912. A name I didn't know, and a date that was more than 100 years old. "Someone," said my grandfather, "this person read this book, and this person left a mark with this bookmark, not knowing that I would find it 100 years later, not knowing that a small boy would see it too. But this mark says, I was here, I lived, I loved this book." And that's immortal, isn't it? The scent grew stronger as I sat on this train between Leipzig and Halle, and I could see my grandfather move through the shelves, past all these books, and he almost caressed them, touched their spines, spoke with them as though they were friends he'd known for a long time. And I understood that for my grandfather, the library wasn't just a workplace. It was a sanctuary. It was a place where he kept watch over humanity's memory, where he made sure these voices didn't die, that these thoughts didn't get lost. And then I remembered his last day in the library. He'd grown old, and it was time to retire. And on his last day, he walked through all the shelves once more, and he touched the books, and he said goodbye to them, quietly, as if he were leaving friends he'd known his whole life. And that evening, he said to me, he didn't say much, but he said, "The books will go on without me. There will be younger people who come, and they'll continue what I did. And that's good, because it means the love doesn't die, that the memory doesn't die." And now, sitting on this train, breathing in the scent of old paper that came to me suddenly, like a message, like a greeting, I understood that my grandfather had taught me something I could never quite forget. He'd taught me that life doesn't live in grand gestures, not in noise, but in these quiet moments, in these tender touches, in these words that are written and wait for someone to read them, that wait for someone to love them. The autumn landscape flew past, grey, still, tired, like the end of a year, like the end of an age. And I could still smell the scent that brought me back to my grandfather, the scent that told me he was still here, that he wasn't gone, that he lived in this scent, in this memory, in this love. And I closed my eyes, and I was small again, and I followed my grandfather through the shelves, and we touched the books together, and everything was quiet, and everything was complete, and everything was good. And my grandfather showed me even more treasures in these shelves. Not just old books, not just dusty pages, but little notes where earlier readers had written their names, had left their thoughts, sentences from the books that were especially important to them. One note said only, beautiful. Another, I didn't understand it, but I like it anyway. And my grandfather said, "That's the real library, you see? It's not the books alone. It's the bridges between people. The bridges we build with our thoughts, with our love, with our words. The books are only the beginning. The people are the truth." And I remembered that my grandfather taught me to always treat a book with great respect, never to bend a page, never to underline a sentence without reason, always to understand that this book had helped other people, that it had a sacred function. And as I sat here on this train, breathing in this wonderful scent of old paper, I understood that this was the greatest lesson he gave me. Not that it's important to read books, but that it's important to live respectfully. That everything other people need deserves to be treated respectfully. And I remembered all the times after my childhood when I went to the library, when my grandfather worked there, and how I saw everything through his eyes. Not as a collection of things, but as a living archive of human experience. And when he died, I went to his funeral. And I didn't weep much, because I knew he was everywhere. In every book someone read, in every bookmark with a name written on it, in every moment when someone turned an old page and discovered a new world. The scent faded, slowly, slowly, and my breath grew quieter, and my thoughts grew weaker, and the shelves of the library became transparent, became dreams, became a memory dissolving in warmth and gentleness. And the old ink, the old paper, the old name on the bookmark from 1912, all of it became a lullaby, a rocking song, a story told across the years from person to person, from grandfather to grandchild and onward, always onward, like a rhythm, like the ta-dum, ta-dum of the train that travels ever on. She sat opposite me on a cold winter's day on the journey from Berlin to Pasewalk, and I immediately recognized that she was on a journey, not just geographically, but temporally. She wasn't just traveling north, but backwards in time, 30 years back, to a life she'd left, but could never truly leave. She was a woman in her 60s, elegant, looking like someone who took care of herself, but with eyes that searched, that questioned, that hoped she would still recognize what she once knew. I asked her where she was going, and she answered, "Home." But it wasn't simply the word home. It was more than that. She said, "To Pasewalk, to home," for the first time in 30 years. And I could see that this sentence had weight, that it contained years, decades of absence, of missing, of longing perhaps buried under other things, under a life she'd lived, but wasn't the life she would have lived if she'd stayed. She told me she'd gone away as a young woman. In 1993, she was 35 years old, and she wanted to see the world, wanted to see something else, something more. Pasewalk was small, was quiet, was the village she was born in, where she'd spent all her youth, and she couldn't stay there any longer, couldn't be in that village any longer, where everyone knew everyone, where nothing changed, where time seemed to stand still. She'd gone to Munich, then to Hamburg, then to Berlin, and she'd lived. Oh yes, she'd lived. Adventure, love, career, success. everything a young woman could have wished for. But Pasewalk, she said. Pasewalk never left my mind. Every winter, when it grew cold, when the light grew thinner, when the days grew shorter, then I thought of Pasewalk, of snowflakes that fell differently in that village, melted differently, shone differently. I think of the main street, of the small market, of the old church, of the people I knew, my mother, my school friends, the bakery where I bought rolls every Sunday. I thought of my father, who's dead, 10 years now, and I wasn't there to bury him. That was the worst. Not to be with him at the end when he was alone. She showed me a photograph, an old black and white one, of a village, of houses, of a street I could at once imagine, old, German, quiet. She said, "This is Pasewalk, 1960, not long before I was born." And she showed me another photo, more recent, perhaps from the 80s, of her, young, beautiful, smiling, in front of the same church. "You were so young," I said, and she smiled. "Yes, I was young, and I was unhappy, and I thought happiness was somewhere else, that youth was somewhere else, that life was somewhere else. But I was wrong," she said slowly. "Life was here too. Life is everywhere. I only learned that after I left." She told me her mother died 2 years ago. "After my mother's death," she said, "I understood there's no time to wait, that there's no time to say next year or someday. My mother is dead. My father is dead. My school friends are older, some of them dead too. The village is older as well, is changing, is becoming something else. And I thought, if I don't go now, if I don't go home now, then I'll never go. And that isn't acceptable. That isn't possible." She asked me whether I thought it was possible to go home after 30 years. Whether a place is still a place when you've left it, when you weren't there while it changed, while it became a place of the past rather than the present. I told her, I think home isn't a place. Home is a feeling, and that feeling can still be there even if the place has changed. And she nodded slowly and said, "Yes, I hope so. I really do hope so." She showed me more photos. A picture of the school where she'd studied. A picture of the forest outside the village where she'd walked. A black and white photograph of her mother, young, at a similar window. Looks like her, the same eyes. And as she showed these images, I saw that time for her wasn't linear. She lived all these moments simultaneously. She was both the old woman and the young girl at once. She was in Berlin and in Pasewalk. She was here and there, everywhere and nowhere, in a state between worlds. That's the secret of missing something, I think. That you inhabit two places at once. That you're never entirely in one place because part of your heart is always somewhere else. She described how she imagined arriving in Pasewalk, how she'd walk out of the station, probably the same station she'd left 30 years ago, and how she'd walk to her mother's house, which stood empty now, which waited only for her to live in it again. "I imagine," she said, "that I'd turn the key and I'd go in, and everything would be quiet, and everything would smell like the past, like my youth, like my parents. And perhaps Perhaps I'll weep. I think I'll weep. And she also said that perhaps it was important that she was away for such a long time, that perhaps she wouldn't have understood who she was if she'd never left. Sometimes, she said, you have to go away to be able to come home. You have to lose perspective to get it back. You have to lose yourself to find yourself. And I lost myself, she said. I was lost in Munich, lost in Hamburg, lost in Berlin. But while I was lost, I found myself somehow along the way. And now I'm ready to go home, not as the woman I was, but as the woman I became while I was away. The train traveled through the winter landscape, through snow-covered fields that all looked the same, all white, all quiet. And it was as if time itself were frozen, as if we were traveling through the past, as if each minute brought us closer to the time this woman had left 30 years before. As if the train were a path through time, not through space. And I saw this woman, this beautiful, elegant woman, who'd lived the whole wide world. And I saw in her also a small girl, a girl who'd been in pacewalk, who'd run through the streets, who'd caught snowflakes in her hands, who'd listened to the bells in the church, who'd loved her mother, her father, this village, though she didn't understand it. And these two women, the young and the old, they sat together on this train, and they traveled home together, finally, after 30 years. The snowflakes grew weaker, rarer, and the darkness of winter came, and I could see the woman looking out the window, her eyes searching, hoping they'd soon arrive in Pacefork, in home, the home she'd left, the home that waited for her. And my own eyes grew tired, very tired, and I leaned my head back, and I thought of all the paths people take away from home, away from the past, away from pain and memory, and how sometimes, the way back is the only way forward, the only way to be whole, to be complete. And the train rattled on, ta-dum, 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 closer to Pacewalk, closer to the snowflakes, closer to the church bells, closer to the house that stood empty and waited for someone whose heart had stayed there for 30 years, while the rest of her saw the world. And now she came home, finally, and everything grew warm, grew soft, grew dark, became... And then I heard it. On the journey from Frankfurt to Würzburg, on a warm spring day when the sun shone bright and the world turned green again, I heard the sound I hadn't heard since my childhood, the sound of wheels on the points, this ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. A sound that isn't just a sound, but a rhythm, a music, a memory that rolled over me like a wave and took me immediately away from this moment, away from the present, to another time, to another person, to myself when I was still a child. I was 5 years old, or perhaps 6, I don't remember exactly. But I remember the safety of childhood years, the way the world is vast when you're small, the way each moment is a whole adventure. My father, My father, who's been dead so long I sometimes forget the color of his eyes. My father took my hand and said, "Today, we're going to Berlin." And for a small child, going to Berlin is the greatest thing there is. It's like flying. It's like reaching the stars. It's like discovering the world. And we boarded the train, and I don't remember the station, but I remember the train. How big it was, how dark, how it smelled of oil and stories I didn't yet know. My father lifted me up, lifted me to his face, and showed me the window and said, "Look, that's the world. That whole world is there, and we're traveling through it." And I looked, and I saw fields and trees and houses, and it was like an invention, like something invented just for me, to show me that there was more than just the room I slept in. And then came the sound. The ta-dum, ta-dum, the first time I heard it. And I was so startled, so surprised, I began to scream, thought something was wrong, thought the train was broken. But my father laughed, and his laugh was like music, and he told me, "That's okay, that's just the points, that's normal, that's the train saying that it's alive." And he took my little hand and placed it on his arm, and with every ta-dum, ta-dum, I felt that my father was alive, that I was alive, that we lived together in this great machine that was taking us somewhere that mattered. And I remember the lunch. We bought rolls from the trolley and ate them, and crumbs fell on my shirt. And I also ate chocolate, and it was the best lunch in the world because we ate it together, because everything was better when my father was there. And all the time we were eating, while we talked, while we laughed, this sound played in the background, this ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And it became part of everything. It became part of my heart. It became part of me. Something I would forget, but also something I could never forget. My father, he told me that the points are like people. Each set of points must make a decision. Shall I go left or right? Shall I take this train or that train? And the train makes the sound to celebrate that, to say, "Yes, I've gone, I've chosen, I'm on this path now, and it's the right path, and I'm happy." And he said to me, "Life is the same, my son. You'll meet many points, make many decisions, and sometimes it will be roaring and confusing. But when you make a decision that's right, then you'll hear a sound too, inside, a sound that says, 'This is the right path.'" And on that day, on that journey from, I don't remember from where, to Berlin, on that day I learned that the world was bigger than I thought, that my father was the person I could trust, that the sound of the points wasn't a sound of fear, but a sound of hope, a sound that meant, it goes on here, life goes on here, things happen here, things change here, we're still alive here. And perhaps 5 years later, or perhaps 10, my father died. And I remember thinking that the sound of the points wouldn't be there anymore, that the music was over, that I'd never hear that sound again, because my father was the music, because my father was the person who explained it, who made it alive. But the sound was there, everywhere, on trains when I had to travel, and every time I heard it, I heard my father too, heard his laugh, saw his eyes that told me, it's okay, it's normal, the train is alive, and you're alive too. And now, 50 years later, on this journey from Frankfurt to Würzburg, I heard the sound again, and it was as if the circle closed, as if my whole life came together in this moment, in this one sound, this ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And I was small, and I was old, and I was my father, and I was the points, and I was the train, and I was the decision made in that moment to say, yes, life goes on. Yes, I'm here. Yes, everything's okay. I remembered the words my father said to me on that first train. Not just the words about the points, but all the other words I'd forgotten that slowly came back to me like a photograph developing in chemicals, image by image, memory by memory. He told me life was an adventure, that the world was big and wonderful, that there was always more to see, that the sound of the points meant movement, progress, decision. And although my father's been dead a long time, although the child I was has also been dead a long time, although so much time has passed that the people I knew have changed or disappeared, although all of that, this sound remains, the lesson remains, the love remains. And the spring landscape flew past, full of green and life and hope, and I close my eyes, and I feel my father take my hand, a hand so warm, so real, that I'm not sure if it's a memory or a dream, or something in between. And we travel together, my father and I. We're still traveling, and the sound of the points accompanies us. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And I know we'll arrive, that there's an end to this journey. But now, in this moment, while the sound rings out, while the points turn, while the train moves, I'm complete. I'm whole. I'm with my father, and that's all I need. I remember my father's laugh, how it echoed through the train, how it made other passengers smile, how it made the whole world warmer with just one laugh. And I see his face still, before me, not old, not young, but unchanging, the way fathers are when you're a child, timeless, infinite, like a point outside time. And I see him give me something, not a thing, but an understanding, a knowledge, a secret I've carried with me my whole life, even if I didn't know I was carrying it, even if I thought I'd forgotten it. The rhythm slows, the eyes fall closed, and the green of the spring landscape becomes a gentle, warm green that's like a blanket covering me, warming me. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. My father, and the points, and the decision, and the small hand holding a large hand. And everything's good, everything's right. The train travels on, but I sleep. I sleep, and I'm not alone, and I will arrive somewhere, someday. But now I simply travel with my father in the ta-dum, ta-dum, until the stars appear and the points make no more decisions, and the train becomes a song, and I, myself. Summer has reached its depth, its full, heavy, glowing depth. And on the fields between Munich and Regensburg, what all these months of growth were for is happening. The combine harvesters have been deployed. Vast machines that look like insects, alien beings almost. But no, they're human-made. They're mankind's tool for the harvest. We travel in the full midday heat, and everywhere I look, I see these clouds of dust. Clouds stirred up by the machines, moving slowly through the grain fields. The dust isn't grey, it's golden, it's orange. It's the color of grain, of ripeness, of work. It's as if someone had turned the sun itself into dust and was now blowing it across the landscape. A combine harvester isn't fast, not really. I can see it pass along the field's edge, a length that takes hours, perhaps a whole day. Behind it, only stubble remains, short-cut stalks, and before it, the full, ripe, golden grain. It's as though it were harvesting time itself, taking every moment and separating it into grain and straw. The driver sits up there in his cabin, small in this giant machine, steering this whole process, this whole transformation of growth into harvest. I can't see him, but I imagine he's concentrated, that he feels the machine, that the machine becomes part of him, that it's no longer about strength, but about understanding. The dust is everywhere now, spreading in all directions, carried by a wind that seems, in these midday hours, to come from the east. There are moments when the dust cloud grows so thick I can no longer see the harvester itself, only its shape, like a silhouette behind a veil. And in those moments, I feel as if I'm looking into another time, into a time when everything was still done by hand, when men and women cut the grain with scythes and helpers gathered the hay with forks. The dust would have been the same then, golden everywhere, the essence of work, the essence of heat. A second harvester works in the field on the other side of the tracks, farther away, but I can see it moving, see how its dust cloud builds, how slow this work is, how methodical. There's no hurrying. The harvest doesn't wait. Ripeness doesn't wait. But neither does the machine hurry. It works in its own tempo. It takes care with each line, each row, to make sure nothing is wasted. That's the essence of harvest. Nothing is quick. Nothing is wild. Everything is full of purpose. The grain stalks are so ripe now, they seem they'd almost break if you touched them. Some are already bending, bowed by their own weight, by the grain hanging heavy on them. There's a beauty that's desolate, the beauty of a thing ready to end, ready to be transformed. The dust stirred up isn't just grain dust, it's also mold, spores, life dancing in the air. I imagine how this dust sits in the lungs of people, the farmers who pursue this work day by day, year by year. This isn't easy work. This is work that needs the body, that uses up the body. We're faster than the machine. The train carries me past quicker than the harvester moves. It's strange to pass so quickly by work that's so slow, by a process that's so thorough. I see the beginning and the end of this dust cloud, and between them is only work, only time, only the endless, methodical transformation of grain into harvest. The sun shines directly into this dust, and by doing so illuminates it, makes it visible, makes it more than just dirt, makes it a substance that's almost materialized, that has form, that has weight almost. Behind the harvester follows a tractor, gathering the straw that's collected by some machine I can't see. There's a whole chain of machines, a whole logistics of harvest that I see only in fragments as the train rushes past. But it's rhythmic, it's organized, it's part of a larger understanding of how to make a harvest, how to separate grain from straw, how to use both. Nothing's wasted, or almost nothing. The soil's prepared for the next sowing, and the ground behind them becomes cleaner, emptier, ready. There are still other fields not yet harvested. Not all grain is ripe. Not all farmers are ready. Not all machines are there. I see fields that are still fuller, still taller, still not so golden, still more green in them. And I also see fields already completely harvested, that are only stubble now, that show only dust, heat, and empty furrows. It's as if I'm seeing different phases of time all at once, overlaid on this journey. Summer has many phases, and the harvest is only one of them, but one that overshadows everything else, that sets the tone for the rest of the year. The dust settles on my window. The dust clouds are so thick here, they actually cover my glass. I open the window a little, and at once the air is filled with this warm, dry, golden dust. It scratches my throat. It lies on my lips. It has a taste of work, of heat, of ripe grain. It's not unpleasant. It's rather honest, rather real. This is summer's life. This is the life of agriculture. This is the life of people working here. A bird flies up from the grain, too fast, startled by the noise and movement of the machine. Perhaps a partridge, perhaps a pheasant. I can't see it clearly through the dust. But there's fear in this flight. There's the memory of the life that existed in these fields, that will soon be destroyed or driven away. This is also part of the harvest, the end for the animals that lived in these fields, that claimed this world for themselves. It's sad and necessary at the same time. It's like everything in life, mixed. The dust cloud grows larger, more intense. The machine comes closer to the tracks, or the field is closer to the tracks here. I can hear the noise, not just the train's noise, but also the machine's noise, the mechanical noise of harvest, louder, shriller, ever closer. It's a sound that can't be ignored, a sound that makes you think of autumn, of endings, of felling, of gathering. The noise mixes with the train's noise and creates a symphonic moment of work, of human activity, of summer approaching its end. And then the machine is past, and the dust cloud diminishes, grows thinner. I see more clearly again, see more of the landscape. But the dust remains in my hair, in my clothes, on my skin. That's what the harvest leaves behind. Not just the grain, not just the straw, but this dust, this golden memory of work. The other harvesters are still active further back, farther away, but closer than they were. The harvest will pass, the fields will become bare, and then there will be quiet again, until next year, when the seed is sown again, and the whole process begins anew. My eyes grow heavy from the dust, from the light, from the heat pouring through the window. The train carries me on, farther away from the harvest fields, and the landscape grows green again, less worked, less intense. But the memory remains. The golden dust cloud, the machine's quiet, the significance of work. I lean my face against the window, and the dust mixes with my breath. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. The train, the harvest, the heat, all one. And my eyelids grow heavy, heavy as the grain stalks, heavy with dust, with the warmth, with the day's heat. The dust was everywhere, was in everything, was part of this journey, this harvest, this summer night. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. Sleep, sleep. The golden dust in the air, in my hair, in my breath. The machine still working somewhere far away, in the dust, in the heat. And I drift away. Sleep, sleep. Ta-dum, ta-dum.